Chapter 33 of The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elaine Tweddle. The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu by Sax Rohmer. Chapter 33 The Mummy. Dinner was out of the question that night for all of us. Karamaneh, who had spoken no word, but grasping my hands had looked into my eyes, her own glassy with unshed tears, and then stolen away to her cabin, had not since reappeared. Seated upon my berth, I stared unseeingly before me, upon a changed ship, a changed sea and sky, upon another world. The poor old bishop, my neighbor, had glanced in several times as he hobbled by, and his spectacles were unmistakably humid. But even he had vouchsafed no word, realizing that my sorrow was too deep for such consolation. When at last I became capable of connected thought, I found myself faced by a big problem. Should I place the facts of the matter as I knew them to be before the captain, or could I hope to apprehend Fu Manchu's servant by the method suggested by my poor friend? That Smith's death was an accident I did not believe for a moment. It was impossible not to link it with the attempt upon Karamaneh. In my misery and doubt I determined to take counsel with Dr. Stacey. I stood up and passed out onto the deck. Those passengers whom I met on my way to his room regarded me in respectful silence. By contrast, Stacey's attitude surprised and even annoyed me. "I'd be prepared to stake all I possess, although it's not much," he said, "that this was not the work of your hidden enemy." He blankly refused to give me his reasons for the statement, and strongly advised me to watch and wait, but to make no communication to the captain. At this hour I can look back and savor again something of the profound dejection of that time. I could not face the passengers. I even avoided Karamaneh and Aziz. I shut myself in my cabin and sat staring aimlessly into the growing darkness. The steward knocked once, inquiring if I needed anything, but I dismissed him abruptly. So I passed the evening and the greater part of the night. Those groups of promenaders who passed my door invariably were discussing my poor friend's tragic end, but as the night wore on the deck grew empty, and I sat amid a silence that in my miserable state I welcomed more than the presence of any friend, saving only the one whom I should never welcome again. Since I had not counted the bells, to this day I have only the vaguest idea respecting the time whereat the next incident occurred which it is my duty to chronicle. Perhaps I was on the verge of falling asleep, seated there as I was. At any rate, I could scarcely believe myself awake, when, unheralded by any footsteps to indicate his coming, someone who seemed to be crouching outside my stateroom, slightly raised himself and peered in through the porthole, which I had not troubled to close. He must have been a fairly tall man to have looked in at all, and although his features were indistinguishable in the darkness, his outline, which was clearly perceptible against the white boat beyond, was unfamiliar to me. He seemed to have a small and oddly swathed head, and what I could make out of the gaunt neck and square shoulders in some way suggested an unnatural thinness. In short, the smudgy silhouette in the porthole was weirdly like that of a mummy. For some moments I stared at the apparition, then rousing myself from the apathy into which I had sunk, I stood up very quickly and stepped across the room. As I did so the figure vanished, and when I threw open the door and looked out upon the deck was wholly untenanted. I realized at once that it would be useless, even had I chosen the course, to seek confirmation of what I had seen from the officer on the bridge. My own berth, together with the one adjoining, that of the bishop, was not visible from the bridge. For some time I stood in my doorway, wondering in a disinterested fashion which I now cannot explain, if the hidden enemy had revealed himself to me, or if disordered imagination had played me a trick. Later I was destined to know the truth of the matter, but when at last I fell into a troubled sleep that night, I was still in some doubt upon the point. My state of mind when I awakened on the following day was indescribable. I found it difficult to doubt that Nayland Smith would meet me on the way to the bathroom as usual, with the cracked briar fuming between his teeth. I felt myself almost compelled to pass around to his stateroom in order to convince myself that he was not totally there. The catastrophe was still unreal to me. and the world a dream world. Indeed, I retain scarcely any recollections of the traffic of the day, or of the days that followed until we reached Port Said. Two things only made any striking appeal to my dulled intelligence at that time. These were the aloof attitude of Dr. Stacey, who seemed carefully to avoid me, and a curious circumstance which the second officer mentioned in conversation one evening as we strolled up and down the main deck together. "Either I was fast asleep at my post, Dr. Petrie," he said, "or last night, in the middle watch, some one or something came over the side of the ship just aft the bridge, slipped across the deck, and disappeared." I stared at him wonderingly. "Do you mean something that came up out of the sea?" I said. "Nothing could very well have come up out of the sea," he replied, smiling slightly, "so that it must have come up from the deck below." "Was it a man?" "It looked like a man, and a fairly tall one, but he came and was gone like a flash, and I saw no more of him up to the time I was relieved. To tell you the truth, I did not report it because I thought I must have been dozing. It's a dead slow watch, and the navigation on this part of the run is child's play." I was on the point of telling him what I had seen myself 2 evenings before, but for some reason I refrained from doing so, although I think had I confided in him he would have abandoned the idea that what he had seen was phantasmal, for the pair of us could not very well have been dreaming. Some malignant presence haunted the ship. I could not doubt this, yet I remained passive, sunk in a lethargy of sorrow. We were scheduled to reach Port Said at about 8 o'clock in the evening, but, by reason of the delay occasioned so tragically, I learned that in all probability we should not arrive earlier than midnight, whilst passengers would not go ashore until the following morning. Karamaneh, who had been staring ahead all day, seeking a first glimpse of her native land, was determined to remain up until the hour of our arrival, but after dinner a notice was posted up that we should not be in before 2 a.m. Even those passengers who were the most enthusiastic thereupon determined to postpone, for a few hours, their first glimpse of the land of the Pharaohs, and even to forego the sight, one of the strangest and most interesting in the world, of Port Said by night. For my own part I confess that all the interest and hope with which I had looked forward to our arrival had left me, and often I detected tears in the eyes of Karamaneh, whereby I knew that the coldness in my heart had manifested itself even to her. I had sustained the greatest blow of my life, and not even the presence of so lovely a companion could entirely recompense me for the loss of my dearest friend. The lights of the Egyptian shore were faintly visible when the last group of stragglers on deck broke up. I had long since prevailed upon Karamaneh to retire, and now, utterly sick at heart, I sought my own stateroom, mechanically undressed, and turned in. It may or may not be singular that I had neglected all precautions since the night of the tragedy. I was not even conscious of a desire to visit retribution upon our hidden enemy. In some strange fashion I took it for granted that there would be no further attempts upon Karamaneh, Aziz, or myself. I had not troubled to confirm Smith's surmise respecting the closing of the portholes, but I know now for a fact that, whereas they had been closed from the time of our leaving the Straits of Messina, to night, in sight of the Egyptian coast, the regulation was relaxed again. I cannot say if this is usual, but that it occurred on this ship is a fact to which I can testify, a fact to which my attention was to be drawn dramatically. The night was steamingly hot, and because I welcomed the circumstance that my own port was widely opened, I reflected that those on the lower decks might be open also. A faint sense of danger stirred within me. Indeed, I sat upright and was about to spring out of my berth when that occurred which induced me to change my mind. All passengers had long since retired, and a midnight silence descended upon the ship, for we were not yet close enough to port for any unusual activities to have commenced. Clearly outlined in the open porthole there suddenly arose that same grotesque silhouette which I had seen once before. Prompted by I know not what, I lay still and simulated heavy breathing, for it was evident to me that I must be partially visible to the watcher, so bright was the night. For 10, 20, 30 seconds he studied me in absolute silence, that gaunt thing, so like a mummy, and with my eyes